So I'm Claire. I think I've met quite a lot of you already, but I'm the Wellbeing Coordinator. And I started in September, so about 6 weeks ago. And yeah, I thought it would be good to just give a bit of a presentation about my background and I guess how I got interested in well-being, mental health and nature connection. And then just thinking about how that might apply to what we might do at Fitzwilliam during the coming months, years. So it'll be a combination of sort of personal experiences, a little bit of evidence-based, so some scientific research on the benefits of nature connection for well-being and mental health, and just a kind of personal take on things. So I guess it all started when I was a teenager, and I spent a lot of time looking like this guy when I was a teenager. So I tended to sort of think quite a lot about things. I guess I had quite a lot of existential concerns when I was a teenager, trying to find meaning in things quite a lot. And I did a lot of reading about sort of religion and philosophy and different ways of thinking about the world, and nothing really kind of made sense to me, as in nothing really resonated with me. And at times my own mental health kind of suffered as a consequence when I was a teenager, so I experienced quite a lot of anxiety and sometimes low mood, just felt like I was experiencing quite a lot of existential challenges, I guess, at quite a young age. And then when I, kind of towards the end of my teenage years, I was about 19, 20, and I went to volunteer on a conservation project, a nature conservation project in the Chilean Lake District. And this is the place that I ended up going to. So it's in kind of northern Patagonia, in Chilean Patagonia. And I did some conservation work with a Chilean NGO out there. And when I spent time in these landscapes, so like these really massive, very inspiring landscapes, I noticed that I started to feel, I guess, a sense of connection and a sense of belonging. I guess I felt quite free to be myself when I was out in nature, in the wild. And I guess when I was in nature was the first time that I started to feel a sense of trust in something that gave me, I guess, a sense of place and a sense of meaning, or that I felt a sense of belonging when I was in touch with the natural world. And that actually then inspired me to work in nature conservation for just under 10 years. So I worked for the World Land Trust and then BirdLife International, before I then became more interested in the kind of therapeutic and well-being value of the natural world. And then I started to think about why when I was in nature, then I felt that sense of belonging and I felt kind of more grounded in myself, that it started to support my well-being and mental health. And I guess it was kind of obvious, or it felt obvious, and when we think about it, then it is obvious that actually we are nature, so we're integrally part of nature. Our bodies are made of the same stuff as the rest of the natural world. Our species evolved in nature. So, when people first evolved millions of years ago, then we were living in the African savanna, and that was our home. And although, when we think about it rationally, the fact that we're part of nature, then it's obvious, in our kind of day-to-day lives now, then there's a sense that perhaps we've forgotten that we're part of nature, and we actually live as if we are separate from nature, and we'll come back to that in a second. And this is just a quote by Alan Watts that I really like, that kind of highlights that. So you didn't come into this world, you came out of it like a wave in the ocean, and it's kind of this idea that actually we are embodying nature ourselves, and that we weren't just kind of parachuted onto the planet from the outside, that we come from it integrally. So for me, one of the main problems that we have, and that's actually the root cause of a lot of the challenges that we face, is that we've lost touch with nature, and consequently, if we are nature, then we've also started to lose touch with ourselves. Why and how did we lose touch with nature? Well, probably something to do with our ability to think consciously. So, again, millions of years ago, when we first evolved, humans were the first species that arguably the first species that had developed a more complex conscious thought. And that enabled us to develop language and labels for things and categorizing things, which helped us to understand and make sense of the world around us. But it was also when we sort of started to develop the activity of the mind, and it started to create that separation between our bodies and our felt experience, and then the kind of abstract world that we can create in our heads, in our mind. And that has enabled us over the years to create this artificial separation between us and the natural world, which, however, is in denial of the reality that actually we are integrally part of nature. And this, again, like I said earlier, this disconnection for me is at the root of a lot of the issues that we face today, whether it's in terms of our own well-being or in terms of the well-being of the rest of the natural world and the rest of the environment that we share the planet with. And the main reason is because it means that we've started to lose touch with our ability to actually pay attention to our felt experience. So it could be our felt experience of ourselves. So that would be our body, our mind, the feedback that our experience of both the body and mind is actually giving us in any given moment. And that disconnection from ourselves and from each other is arguably one of the root causes for some of the mental health challenges that we experience. So things like anxiety, depression, burning out, all sorts of other mental health challenges and conditions. And a simple example of that is if we're working really hard and we start to feel really tired or really stressed, our body will give us feedback, or our mind will start to give us feedback. We'll start to feel tired, we'll start to feel kind of drained, we'll start to feel a bit burnt out. But what we tend to do is ignore that feedback. So we tend to just carry on, we tend to just push through. There are lots of reasons for that. Some of them are just sort of cultural, some of them are because of our history and how we were brought up and what we believe we need to do to be valuable, and we could go into all of that another time. But essentially that pushing through and ignoring the feedback tends to lead us to feel more burnt out, potentially lower, potentially more anxious, etc. So essentially it's not sustainable, and the feedback is there for a reason. But we've stopped listening to it a lot of the time. And the same applies to the rest of nature. So if we're talking about the environmental crisis that we're facing, then we're receiving feedback all the time. The climate change conference is happening at the moment. But we're receiving feedback about the warming of the planet and loss of species, loss of habitats, and the consequences of that. Yet, to a very large degree, we're still ignoring that feedback. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. But the point is, it's exactly the same principle of ignoring feedback. And in the long term, it's not sustainable. So these are some of the consequences of ignoring that feedback for well-being and mental health specifically. So there's somebody called Richard Louv who wrote a book about what he called nature deficit disorder. And essentially, nature deficit disorder is all of the consequences of our disconnection between us and nature, us and ourselves. Again, similar sort of mental health challenges that are described up there, but also hyperactivity, like ADHD kind of disorders, more acute and chronic physical and psychological conditions that happen as a result of that build-up of ignoring the feedback that we get, loss of creativity, mental fatigue, etc. And also, like I say, consequences for the well-being of the rest of the natural world as well. Because again, if you take the view the reality, arguably, that we are nature, then what we do to nature, we're actually doing to ourselves. What we do to ourselves, we're doing to nature. And we tend to, if you think about your day-to-day life, we tend to protect what we love, and we tend to love what we feel connected to. So if we don't feel that connected to the wider natural world, then it's very unlikely that we're going to continue to take action to protect the natural world. So again, that felt experience of connection is really important in nature conservation as well. So this brings me to talking a little bit about mindfulness and what mindfulness has to do with some of these issues. I put mindfulness of nature in brackets because for me, so sometimes people will teach mindfulness indoors in a room, or they might teach it outdoors. But the point is, if we're talking about ourselves as being part of nature, then if we're being mindful of our own experience, that's also a natural experience. So that's why. So this is just a very succinct slide to explain what mindfulness is about. So on the left, it's basically somebody who's kind of lost in their mind on arguably what is 80% of the time unchecked. We tend to spend our time lost in thought, in that kind of automatic mode of being, which is quite a reactive way of being. So say when we get lots of demands thrown upon us at work or in study or in life in general, we just kind of, we have all these thoughts in our mind of like, oh, I should do this, I've got all of this stuff on my to-do list. And we just unconsciously just listen to that. So we find ourselves running around, not really choosing what we're actually doing, but just reacting. And that's sometimes called the autopilot mode of being. The problem is, if we're focusing our attention on, say, things that actually we don't value, for example, then that can lead us to feel a lack of meaning. If we're focusing our attention on things that are just burning us out more and more, then that can start to impact our well-being and mental health. So yeah, on the left-hand side, there isn't really a conscious choice as to what we're paying attention to, and that has consequences. On the right-hand side, it's just a basic illustration of what mindfulness is about. So in any given moment, sure, we have our thoughts and we have everything that goes on through the mind, but we also have emotions, sounds, sights, sensations in the body, smells. So we have all these other aspects of our experience, and of course they all interact with each other. And mindfulness is basically about becoming aware of all of those other parts of our experience that are always present in any given moment. And once we have that awareness, so once we know what's actually happening in our experience at any given moment, then it gives us the power to make a choice as to what we actually want to pay attention to, what we're choosing to pay attention to. And so it gives us the power to respond rather than react. And that's why I put the word responsibility, because a lot of kind of mindfulness practice, at least for me, is about taking responsibility again for what our experience is, not in the sense of blaming ourselves for it, because that's not what it's about, but more about choosing how we respond to it in a way that will be wiser in terms of our well-being, the well-being of others, and the wider world. This is just a kind of similar, but it's just a simple diagram, just to illustrate that in any given moment, the thoughts that we experience and the feelings or the emotions that we experience, we don't actually have any control over that when it happens, as you'll all know from your experience of being alive. But also importantly, how we feel in any given moment isn't actually our fault. So it's not about something that we've done consciously. It's usually the result of our past and everything that's happening in that moment, and that will lead us to feel how we feel at that time. So we don't have any power up there in the moment, but again, we do have power on the bottom part, which is the behavior part, which is how we respond to that. I don't know if some of you have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. Some of cognitive behavioral therapy is kind of based on something a little bit like this. This is kind of my personal take on it, but it's very similar to that. The other aspect to mindfulness so it's about paying attention, but it's also about how we pay attention. So there's a whole set of attitudes or colours, if you like, that we bring to our attention when we're paying attention. And these are things such as compassion, such as paying attention in a non-judgmental way, because, like I said earlier, how we feel and what we think is not our fault. So it's about just recognizing what it is. A beginner's mind is kind of looking at our experience almost as if we were seeing it for the first time. So it's kind of taking that childlike attitude to it and that attitude of curiosity to it, being interested in our experience. And then the last two, acceptance and allowing. So again, allowing our experience to be what it is, because we can't fight it, we can't change it in that moment. So yeah, those are a set of different attitudes that apply when we're talking about mindfulness. So this is just, I guess, a kind of summary of where we are now. So sometimes mindfulness is portrayed as like some state that we could attain that some other people have attained and we can't attain, and it sounds really complicated. And the word mindfulness, despite having written 2 books about it, I actually hate the word mindfulness. And there just isn't another word in the English language to explain what it's about. But actually, it's about rekindling a natural skill or a natural ability that we all already have in us. We're already being mindful some of the time. And it's just remembering how to do that. And in particular, remembering how to listen to our experience, as I say, of ourselves, each other, and the wider world. So it's much more about kind of making a shift in how we relate to our experience rather than actually changing our experience. It's just approaching it in a slightly different way in order to be able to respond and come off that autopilot mode. So this is just some of the research around, or some of the results of the research around mindfulness and nature connection. And the most interesting thing about it is that the benefits that have been shown from mindfulness practice and the benefits that have been shown from nature connection are very similar. And again, that's not that surprising, because often what we're doing when we're practicing mindfulness or when we're in nature is coming out of our mind, so again, coming out of that automatic mode and coming into our senses and into the body. And then naturally, all of this stuff kind of just happens because we're reconnecting with our direct felt experience. So things like creativity improve, self-awareness, better overall mental health, emotional well-being, improve sleep, etc. You can read the others. And at the bottom, just saying that nature connection supports mindfulness. So the reason why I have taught mindfulness in nature, outdoors, is because there's something, when we're outdoors, because we are nature, because there's that sense of belonging, our senses kind of recognize it as a place that's almost like a home to the body. And so we naturally come out of the mind. You know, if you go for a walk, like a long walk in a nature reserve, even if you're not consciously practicing mindfulness and consciously paying attention, you'll notice after whatever, an hour, a couple of hours, that your mind will start to settle and you will start to feel more present. And that's just from the body being back in touch with natural scents and sounds and sights and things like that. These are some other, or the results of some other experiments that they did in Japan. So they called it forest bathing. Again, ultimately, forest bathing is being mindful in forests. But often people quite like to have their niche things, and they're all very similar. But they were really interesting experiments. They got people to walk through urban environments as opposed to walk through forests. And they showed that, so firstly, walking through forests increases the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that is activated when we are resting, or when we're digesting, or when we're breathing, or when we're sleeping. So it's that kind of regenerative activity of the nervous system, as opposed to the sympathetic nervous system, which is the one that's activated when we need to fight or fly away from a threat, walk away from a threat. So it takes us out of that fight and flight stress mode and into a rest mode. And it reduces cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It reduces the production of that. frees up our creativity, boosts the immune system, again, all those kind of health benefits. This was also a really interesting piece of research because a lot of the time in nature conservation, in the field of nature conservation, when people are, or when nature conservationists are trying to inspire more people to care about nature or to feel connected to nature, for a very long time, because of our Western culture being quite head-focused, head-based, then we've been trying to do it through teaching about nature. So through teaching kids the name of species, or teaching them ecology, or teaching the kind of scientific basis for an understanding of nature. And don't get me wrong, I was trained as a biologist. I did natural sciences at Emmanuel College, so it's all really relevant and worthwhile stuff. But it's not the whole picture, because, as I said earlier, there are all the other aspects to our experience that actually are often they're stronger motivators of our behavior. So this research showed that the degree to which people feel connected to nature and feel that care for nature is very much more about engaging with the senses. It's about emotional connection. It's about feeling a sense of meaning or belonging in touch with nature. And all of that is really important for well-being and mental health, but also in terms of changing our attitude towards the natural world and kind of engaging in more sustainable behaviors in relationship to nature. So in practice, so these are just some exercises or things we can do in nature to put some of these things in practice. There are some exercises that if you come to some of the events that I'll be running in college, we could hopefully practice some of these in the gardens, possibly more in the spring and summer, but we'll see how we go. So there's an exercise called the sit spot, which I think I was talking to Nicola about this actually from communications, that at some point it might be nice to make the sit spot an exercise that could be practiced in the gardens in the college, because it's a really simple exercise where you just go and sit for 20 minutes somewhere and pay attention to your different senses. And there's a little bit more to it, which you can find out more if we talk about it more. But it's a really nice way to engage with what's around you, and also if you stay in one place for 20 minutes, then not only does your mind start to settle, but also the wildlife around you starts to no longer see you as a threat, because it's kind of accepted your presence wherever you've decided to sit. So it's quite a good way to encourage encounters with wildlife. And there are lots of places in the college where you could put this in practice. It's very easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. And then there are all sorts of other exercises that, as I say, if you come to some of the events, then you can find out more. I was going to say one other thing on this. Yeah, and also the important thing is that you don't actually have to go and sit down and practice mindfulness or meditation. The important thing is about engaging with nature in a way that kind of inspires your felt experience. So ideally, something that you enjoy in nature is the most important thing that kind of connects you to that more emotional basis for connecting with nature. And it's the same with mindfulness generally. When we sit and practice mindfulness, it's a way to sort of practice that skill of coming out of the mind and into the body. But there are loads of things that we can do. Well, we can do anything mindfully, whatever, we can talk to each other mindfully, we can read mindfully, we can cook mindfully. It's just about how we do it and how we engage with that experience. So it doesn't require meditation is the point. These are just a few personal thoughts, I guess, as we sort of come to the end. So this cultural shift is sort of starting to happen. It's quite a slow shift, but it's definitely happening. And I feel like there needs to be a shift from disconnection to connection, like we were talking about at the beginning. From being always in this mode of effort all the time with that sympathetic nervous system activity to being more in a place of rest. That doesn't mean we should not do anything with our days. It's more that there's a value to rest to sort of balance out that effort. And actually, if we can get a better balance of that, then we start to, if we're talking about problem solving, we start to respond in more creative ways to the problems that we're trying to solve, for example. From effort to rest, from autopilot to something more creative, which is what we were talking about earlier. From thinking to allowing ourselves to feel more without it being pathologized. So at the moment, it's great that mental health is getting a spotlight, obviously, it's really important. But it's slightly gone from one extreme to the other, arguably, where we've had generations where we haven't talked about mental health at all, and we haven't talked about the value and importance of our thoughts and feelings, to now where every time we feel an emotion, it's like maybe there's something wrong with us. And there's a whole spectrum. Of course, there are mental health conditions that are clinical and that need to be treated and taken very seriously. But there's a little bit of a danger of then pathologizing every single painful emotion that we have. And actually, again, our painful emotions are feedback about our experience, about what matters to us, about, if we feel angry, it's about what's okay and not okay for us. If we feel sad, it's about the fact that we've lost something that we cared about. So all of those things are really important emotions, and there's a bit of a danger in making them all something to get rid of. Definitely not. From chasing positive emotions to actually allowing the full spectrum of emotions, kind of what I was just saying. Similarly, from moving from a place of needing to be in control all the time, which again is that sympathetic nervous system, to tolerating uncertainty a little bit more. So, we all know that uncertainty is part of life, and it's very challenging to tolerate uncertainty because we like to be in control. I think the last 2 years have faced us with what it's like to, what that uncertainty is like and that it's real. But again, it's not about getting rid of the uncertainty because that's just how nature, life is and works. It's about learning to tolerate it better. Lastly, that shift it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of vulnerability because it means that we have to acknowledge uncertainty, for example, acknowledge difficult emotion, and consequently trust, which sort of comes into all of that. Very quickly, so in terms of the work at Fitz, I think there's two sides to it. There's one side to it that's going to be about responding to the. I don't like using the word crisis because it sounds really dramatic, and I don't mean to make it sound dramatic because that's unhelpful. But we have a challenge with mental health at the moment because of the fact that this hasn't been acknowledged for a few generations. So there's a backlash to that. And managing how we respond to that is part of my role, at least in the college. But then there's a second part to the role, which I think is even more important, which is actually trying to nurture a community that starts to support that sense of responsibility that I was talking about, where it's okay to feel emotions, where we can build trust, and where we can sort of retake responsibility in the sense of learning how to take care of ourselves and learning how to then support and take care of other people, and knowing where the boundary is between those things. And there's more I could say, but I'll leave it there for that. And then just some values that I think we could base some of that change on. Listening, community, compassion, belonging, respect, and nature connection. I think Fitz has got some beautiful gardens, and I hope that we can make use of that in terms of supporting some of these things. This is just a summary of what my role is starting to. Well, it was what it was advertised as well, but I've been trying to sort of define it more clearly since I've been here in the last 6 weeks. So there's definitely a one-to-one support role. Definitely, a space where you can come, anybody can come, be listened to, feel heard, and then pointed to where they need to go for the relevant support. But also, hopefully, to think about more of an overall strategy for well-being in the college that can continue to support that second point about nurturing a community with some of those values. And then, as a consequence of that, to sort of set up some of the processes that need to be put in place around supporting mental health and well-being in the college, identifying training requirements where needed for staff and sometimes students as well, organising events, and then also bringing together the team that exists in the college. So obviously we've got me, but then there's also Graham, the chaplain, the counsellor, the nurse, so trying to sort of make more of a team and facilitate, I guess, more coordination between those team members and supporting each other and things like that, which in turn will make it a stronger team for the college, to support the college. This is just an advert for my mindfulness classes. Just to say that at the moment I've set up 2 sessions for mindfulness at these times in the old SCR, unless it's really sunny and people want to sit outside. Those times at the moment, they may be subject to change. I'm just experimenting with what works for who and how many people come along. But yeah, come along and find out what mindfulness is about. Or if you have already practiced mindfulness, then come along and enjoy half an hour of mindfulness with other people. And that's it. So yeah, if you have any questions now, I'm probably a bit over time. 4 minutes over time. Please feel free to ask questions now or get in touch by email. And I'm open for discussion anytime. So.